He was born in 1889 in a small Austrian town called Braunau am Inn. No one in that quiet village could have imagined that this pale, quiet child would one day become one of the most feared men in human history. Adolf Hitler's story is a dark journey of obsession, hate, and the destruction of millions. Hitler's early life was filled with failure and frustration. He dreamed of becoming an artist, but twice he was rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Alone and poor, he lived in shelters, selling sketches to survive. In Vienna, he developed his deep hatred toward Jews and foreigners. He believed they were the reason for his own failures and for the suffering of the German people. Those years turned anger into ideology. When the First World War began in 1914, Hitler volunteered to fight for Germany. He found in war what he could not find in peace: a sense of purpose. He was wounded and even temporarily blinded by gas. When Germany finally surrendered in 1918, he refused to accept it. He felt betrayed, believing that the country had been stabbed in the back by traitors, Jews, communists, and politicians. This belief became the foundation of his evil vision. After the war, Germany was broken. The Treaty of Versailles punished it harshly. Land lost, army reduced, economy destroyed. People were hungry, humiliated, and angry. Hitler saw an opportunity. In 1919, he joined a small political group, the German Workers' Party. Within a few years, he had turned it into a powerful movement, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. His speeches were full of fury and passion. He promised revenge, unity, and greatness.
Million Listend.
By 1933, through manipulation, propaganda, and intimidation, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. He immediately destroyed democracy and built a totalitarian state. The Nazi regime controlled everything: the media, schools, the army, and even art. Children grew up chanting his name. He told the German people that they were a superior race, destined to rule over others. He claimed that Jews were enemies of humanity, parasites to be removed. Lies became law. Behind Hitler's power was fear. His secret police, the Gestapo, arrested anyone who opposed him. Books were burned. Truth was silenced. And yet, many Germans followed him blindly. They believed he could restore pride and order. Hitler gave them jobs, roads, and a dream, but in exchange, he took away their freedom and their morality. In 1939, he invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. His armies marched across Europe like a storm. France fell. Britain stood alone. Hitler's voice echoed across the continent, promising victory while planning destruction. He saw himself not as a man, but as a savior chosen by destiny. His speeches became darker, his hatred deeper. Then came the final solution: the plan to exterminate the Jewish people. Millions were deported to concentration camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. Families were torn apart. Children were killed. Bodies were burned in silence. Hitler believed he was creating a pure world, but in truth, he was building a kingdom of death. Under his orders, over 6 million Jews and millions of others, Romani people, Poles, Russians, the disabled, were murdered. Inside his private circle, Hitler was not a monster in appearance. He was calm, soft-spoken, even polite. But beneath that surface lived an obsession with control and destruction. He surrounded himself with loyal followers: Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, men who carried out his brutal commands without question. Together, they turned ideology into machinery, a system that killed with precision and bureaucracy. By 1943, his empire began to crumble. The Soviet army pushed from the east, the Allies from the west. Yet, even as Germany burned, Hitler refused to surrender. He ordered his soldiers to fight to the last man. Cities were reduced to rubble. Children as young as 12 were sent to die for him. He could not accept defeat. not for himself, nor for his twisted dream. In April 1945, the Red Army entered Berlin. Deep underground, in a concrete bunker, Hitler lived his final days. The man who once commanded millions now sat trembling, betrayed by his own madness. He blamed everyone, his generals, his people, even fate. On April 30th, 1945, he shot himself, ending his life but leaving behind a world in ruins. But death did not erase his evil. The scars remained, in the ashes of cities, in the memories of survivors, in the lessons of history. Hitler's evil was not born overnight. It grew from hate, fear, and ignorance. He convinced a nation to follow him, not by force alone, but by manipulating their hopes and fears. Why was he so evil? Historians still debate the question. Was it madness, ideology, narcissism? Perhaps all of them. But at the core, his evil came from a simple human flaw, the belief that one person, one race, one vision is superior to all others. From that belief came genocide, war, and suffering beyond imagination. The story of Adolf Hitler is not just the story of one man. It is a warning of what happens when hate becomes law, when lies replace truth, and when people stop questioning the voice that promises greatness. Evil does not begin with fire and blood. It begins with words, with silence, with looking away. Today, the world still studies him, not to admire, but to remember, to understand how fragile humanity can be, and how important it is to resist hatred in every form. Because as long as people forget, evil can rise again. When people speak of the Second World War, they often think of Hitler's armies, of the battles in Europe, and the fall of Germany. But behind the Eastern Front lay another force just as powerful, just as ruthless, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. His leadership changed the course of the war, but it came at an unbearable cost for his own people. Joseph Stalin was not a soldier by training. He was a politician, a manipulator, a man who built an empire of fear long before the war began. Born in Georgia in 1878, he rose through the ranks of the Bolshevik Party after the Russian Revolution. By the late 1920s, Stalin had eliminated his rivals and become the unquestioned ruler of the USSR. Under his command, millions were imprisoned, deported, or executed during the Great Purge. The Soviet Union entered the 1940s as a nation terrified of its own leader. When Hitler came to power in Germany, Stalin saw both danger and opportunity. In August 1939, the world was shocked when the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. Only days later, Hitler invaded Poland from the west, and Soviet troops marched in from the east. The two dictators, once ideological enemies, had carved up a nation together. For Stalin, it was a way to buy time. For Hitler, it was a step toward his greater conquest. But time was not on Stalin's side. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory without warning. Stalin refused to believe it at first. Reports came in of German bombings and advancing troops, yet he insisted it must be a mistake. For days he said nothing. When he finally addressed the nation, his voice was shaken. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets would call it, had begun. The first months were catastrophic. Entire armies were surrounded. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. Cities like Minsk, Kiev, and Smolensk fell. The Red Army was disorganized and poorly equipped. Stalin's purges had destroyed much of the officer corps. Generals who could have led the defense were already dead or imprisoned. The Soviet Union stood on the edge of collapse. Yet in the darkness, something changed. Stalin, once paralyzed by shock, began to harden. He understood that this was not just a war of armies. It was a war for survival. He called on his people to fight for Mother Russia. He moved factories eastward, far beyond the reach of German bombers, turning them into massive centers of tank and weapon production. The people worked day and night, often starving, yet never stopping. In the fall of 1941, Hitler's forces reached the gates of Moscow. The world expected the Soviet capital to fall, but Stalin refused to flee. He stayed in the city, delivering speeches that inspired millions. "Not one step back," he ordered. Soviet troops dug trenches, fought in freezing temperatures, and, against all odds, held their ground. In December, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back for the first time. It was a turning point, proof that Hitler could be stopped. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Stalin ruled with iron fear. Anyone who retreated without orders was executed. Civilians suspected of disloyalty were deported to Siberia. Thousands died not only at the hands of the enemy but from their own government. To Stalin, human life was a tool, a resource to be spent in the name of victory. The following year brought one of the most brutal battles in history, Stalingrad. Hitler wanted to capture the city that bore Stalin's name, seeing it as a symbol of domination. From August 1942 to February 1943, the two armies fought for every street, every building, every room. The city turned into rubble. Soviet snipers hid in ruins. Civilians starved, freezing in the winter cold. Yet they did not surrender. When the Red Army finally encircled the German Sixth Army, it was a disaster for Hitler and a triumph for Stalin. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers were captured or killed. Stalingrad became the graveyard of the Nazi dream. After that victory, Stalin's confidence grew. He saw himself as the savior of his nation, the supreme commander who could not be questioned. The Soviet war machine rolled westward, reclaiming territory village by village. Entire cities were liberated and sometimes destroyed again, this time by Soviet revenge. Stalin ordered scorched earth tactics, leaving nothing for the enemy but ashes. In 1943, the Allies, Britain and the United States, began coordinating more closely with Stalin. They needed his army to keep pressure on Germany from the east. At the Tehran Conference and later at Yalta, Stalin sat beside Churchill and Roosevelt as an equal. The world saw him as one of the big three, a hero of resistance. But behind closed doors, Stalin was already planning his post-war empire. He demanded control over Eastern Europe, ensuring that after the war, half the continent would fall under Soviet influence. As the Red Army pushed toward Berlin in 1945, the full horror of the Eastern Front became clear. Entire villages had been erased. Millions of Soviet soldiers, more than 8 million, had died. Yet Stalin drove his troops forward. He wanted Berlin before the Western Allies arrived. In May 1945, the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. Hitler was dead, Germany was defeated, and Stalin stood as the victor of Europe. But victory did not bring peace. Stalin's paranoia deepened. He feared his own generals' popularity and continued his repression. Those who had survived the war often found themselves sent to labor camps instead of homecomings. The same iron fist that had defeated Hitler now crushed its own people once more. By the time the war ended, the Soviet Union had suffered more than 26 million deaths, soldiers and civilians alike. No country paid a higher price. Yet Stalin saw the loss not as tragedy, but as proof of strength. He turned victory into propaganda, shaping himself into the father of nations, the man who had saved the world from fascism. History, however, paints a darker picture. Stalin's leadership was both heroic and monstrous. Without his ruthless discipline, the Soviet Union might not have survived the German invasion. But it was that same ruthlessness that caused unimaginable suffering. He destroyed as much as he defended. In the end, Stalin's role in the war cannot be seen in black and white. He was neither hero nor villain alone, he was both. His strength helped defeat one evil, yet his cruelty created another. The world owes part of its freedom to the Soviet victory, but millions paid for it with their lives. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Stalin emerged as one of the most powerful men on earth, the ruler of a superpower, feared by enemies and allies alike. But behind his triumph stood graves stretching from Moscow to Berlin, a haunting reminder that victory built on fear always leaves shadows behind. When Adolf Hitler and his followers seized power in 1933, few outside Germany truly understood what the Nazis wanted. They promised national revival, pride, and order, but behind those promises hid one of the most destructive ideologies the world has ever seen. The Nazi goal was not just political control. It was the complete transformation of humanity itself, through race, war, and domination. The roots of Nazism stretched deep into Germany's past. After the First World War, the nation was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Its economy collapsed, its people suffered hunger and unemployment, and its pride was broken. In this chaos, Hitler's message of revenge and rebirth found fertile ground. He spoke of a new German empire, a Third Reich, that would last 1,000 years. To many, it sounded like hope. In truth, it was a blueprint for genocide. At the heart of Nazi ideology was racial hierarchy, the belief that not all humans were equal. The Nazis taught that the Aryan race, especially Germans of Nordic descent, were the highest form of humanity, strong, pure, and destined to rule. Beneath them were inferior races, Slavs, Romani people, Jews, and many others. Hitler's book Mein Kampf made it clear. He saw history as a struggle between races, and survival belonged only to the strongest. To achieve their goal, the Nazis would reshape society through persecution, war, and terror. From the moment they came to power, they began to remake Germany. Schools taught children to worship Hitler and embrace racial purity. Textbooks described Jews as parasites, unworthy of life. Science was twisted into propaganda, promoting eugenics, sterilization, and the elimination of the weak. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and banned marriage between Jews and Aryans. It was the legal foundation for what would soon become the Holocaust. But the Nazis wanted more than social control. They wanted land, Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler believed that Germany's future lay in conquering the East, in seizing vast territories from Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. There, he planned to create a new empire, populated by German settlers and built on the bones of those they displaced or destroyed. Millions would be enslaved, starved, or exterminated to make room for the master race. The Nazi state was organized like a machine. Every part had a purpose. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, enforced racial purity and ran the concentration camps. The Gestapo hunted down political enemies and ordinary citizens who dared to speak against the regime. The Wehrmacht carried out Hitler's wars, while Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda filled the airwaves with lies. Newspapers, radio, film, all repeated the same message. Germany was chosen, Hitler was its savior, and its enemies were inhuman. By 1939, the machine was ready. When German troops invaded Poland, the world was thrown into war. Behind the front lines, Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing units, followed the army, executing Jews, intellectuals, and anyone seen as a threat. Villages were burned, graves were filled. These massacres were not chaos, they were organized steps toward the Nazi goal. The cleansing of Europe. As the war spread, Nazi power expanded with it. They built ghettos in occupied cities like Warsaw and Lodz, where Jews were forced to live in overcrowded, starving conditions. Then came deportations. Trains carried millions to camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Families were torn apart at the gates. Some were forced into labor. Most were sent directly to the gas chambers. In the name of their new world, the Nazis murdered over 6 million Jews and millions of others. Poles, Soviet prisoners, Romani people, and the disabled. But the Nazi vision was not just about extermination. It was about replacing everything religion, art, morality with their ideology. Hitler wanted to build a world where obedience was virtue and cruelty was strength. Churches were silenced or controlled. Books were burned. Artists were censored. The Nazis dreamed of a future where every German thought the same, acted the same, and worshipped the same leader. It was not just a political system, it was a cult. Behind the fanatical speeches and parades lay another side of the regime, cold, bureaucratic evil. Every genocide, every deportation, every murder was recorded on paper, signed by officials, stamped with approval. Evil became routine, efficient, and organized. Ordinary men filled forms, scheduled trains, and sent millions to their deaths without ever seeing their faces. That was part of the Nazi goal too, to make killing impersonal, mechanical, inevitable. As the war dragged on, their delusions grew. Even when Germany began losing, the Nazis refused to surrender. Hitler ordered total war. Every resource, every man, woman, and child had to serve the Reich. Cities were reduced to ashes, and yet they kept fighting. In his final days, Hitler blamed the German people themselves for failing him. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich ended in 12 years, in smoke and ruin. When the Allies finally liberated the camps in 1945, the world saw the full extent of Nazi crimes. Piles of bodies, ashes, human hair, and shoes, the remains of an ideology built on hatred. Soldiers who entered those camps wept. They could not believe that such cruelty was possible on such a scale. At the Nuremberg trials, surviving Nazi leaders faced justice. Some hanged, others imprisoned. But no punishment could ever balance what they had done. So what was the true goal of the Nazis? It was not just conquest. It was to rewrite humanity, to create a world purified of diversity, ruled by one race, one leader, one truth. In their vision, there was no room for compassion, no space for doubt, no mercy for difference. They believed they could perfect mankind by destroying it. The Nazi dream was a nightmare, and its ashes still remind the world of what happens when hate becomes a system, when lies are treated as truth, and when people stop questioning the power that controls them. Even today, the shadow of the swastika warns us, evil rarely begins with violence. It begins with words, with prejudice, with division, with silence. The Nazis' true goal was not only to conquer nations, but to conquer minds. And for a time, they succeeded. Millions believed, millions obeyed, and millions died. But in the end, their perfect world collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. Humanity, though wounded, survived. The ruins of Berlin, the graves across Europe, and the memories of the survivors all whisper the same truth: that no ideology, no flag, and no leader should ever have the power to decide who deserves to live and who must die. That was the real goal of the Nazis, and the reason the world must never forget. It was the morning of August 6, 1945, when the world changed forever. At 8:15 a.m., a single American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Inside, a weapon unlike any ever built rested quietly, a bomb powered by the destruction of atoms. When it fell, the sky turned white, then red, then black. In a single instant, an entire city vanished. Why was it done? Why did the United States decide to use such a terrible weapon, not once but twice, on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The answer lies in the closing months of the Second World War, when desperation, fear, and ambition collided in a decision that would shape the future of humanity. By mid-1945, Nazi Germany had fallen. Hitler was dead. Europe was in ruins. But the war in the Pacific raged on. Japan refused to surrender. Its soldiers fought with a fanatic devotion, defending every island to the last man. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown the Allies what invasion meant. Tens of thousands of Americans dead, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians killed, and no sign of surrender. American planners estimated that invading the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, could cost over 1 million Allied casualties and perhaps 10 million Japanese lives. Japan's code of honor, Bushido, rejected surrender. Civilians were being trained to fight with bamboo spears. It seemed there would be no end except through complete destruction. Meanwhile, in the deserts of New Mexico, scientists were finishing a secret project that could end the war in a single blow. It was called the Manhattan Project, a collaboration of the world's greatest minds, physicists like Oppenheimer, Fermi, and Teller, all working in secrecy to create an atomic bomb. On July 16, 1945, they tested their creation at a site called Trinity. The explosion lit up the night like a second sun. Oppenheimer, watching in awe and terror, whispered words from ancient scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Only weeks later, President Harry S. Truman faced the most difficult decision any leader had ever made. The bomb worked, but should it be used? His military advisors argued that Japan would never surrender without a shock so great it would break their spirit. Others warned that the Soviet Union, now occupying half of Europe, was preparing to enter the war against Japan, and that using the bomb might also send a message to Moscow about American power. Truman made his choice. "We shall use it," he said, "so that military objectives and soldiers are targeted, not women and children." But the reality would prove far different. At 8:15 a.m., August 6th, the bomb nicknamed Little Boy fell over Hiroshima. For 43 seconds, it dropped silently, then exploded 600 meters above the ground. The temperature at the center reached more than 4,000 degrees Celsius. Buildings disappeared. Rivers boiled. People walking in the streets were turned to shadows burned into stone. Within seconds, 70,000 people were dead. By the end of the year, radiation would claim tens of thousands more. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Clouds had hidden the original target, Kakura, so the bomber turned to its secondary city. The explosion was even more powerful, flattening entire districts and killing 40,000 instantly. The sky filled with black rain, carrying radioactive ash. Survivors staggered through the ruins, their skin burned, their voices silent. The world had entered the nuclear age. Why 2 bombs? Some historians believe the second was to force Japan to surrender faster, before the Soviets could invade and gain influence in Asia. Others see it as a test, to measure the effects of different bomb designs. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: total devastation. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation by radio, the first time the Japanese people had ever heard his voice. "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb," he said. "If we continue to fight, it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization." With those words, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Across the Pacific, Americans celebrated. After nearly 4 years of brutal conflict, peace had come at last. But even as crowds cheered, others felt uneasy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Admiral William Leahy both later said they opposed the bombings, believing Japan was already on the verge of surrender. But for Truman, the bomb had saved countless American lives. "I have no regrets," he said. "We used it to end the war, And that's what we did. In Japan, the suffering continued long after the explosions. The survivors, known as hibakusha, faced lifelong illness, disfigurement, and discrimination. Many died slowly from radiation poisoning, their bodies failing years later. Doctors had never seen anything like it. Children born in Hiroshima and Nagasaki carried the scars of their parents' exposure. The cities became living reminders of humanity's power and its cruelty. As the truth spread, the world began to question what it had done. Photographs of melted skin, burned children, and leveled cities shocked the conscience of mankind. What had been hailed as victory now looked like horror. The same scientists who had built the bomb began speaking against it. Oppenheimer himself warned, "The physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." But the bomb had already changed everything. Within years, the Soviet Union built its own atomic weapon. The Cold War began, a new kind of war fought not on battlefields but in laboratories and missile silos. Nations no longer measured strength by armies, but by how many times they could destroy the world. So why was it dropped? To end the war quickly, to save lives, at least that was the justification. But beneath the surface lay deeper motives. Power, fear, and the dawn of an age where humanity learned it could annihilate itself with a single command. The atomic bomb did end the Second World War, but it also began a new one, a silent war of deterrence and fear that still shadows our planet today. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military acts. They were a message to the future, a warning of what humans are capable of when science and war unite without conscience. Today, when you walk through Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park, you can still hear the echoes of that morning. The clock stopped at 8:15. The shadows remain on the walls, and the survivors' voices remind the world, never again. The bomb was meant to bring peace, but it also brought the knowledge of our own destruction. And that knowledge changed humanity forever. It was still dark on the morning of June 6, 1944. Over the cold waters of the English Channel, more than 5,000 ships carried an army across the sea, an army of hope. On board were 156,000 Allied soldiers, packed tightly, seasick, silent, and afraid. The largest amphibious invasion in history was about to begin. They called it Operation Overlord, but the world would remember it by another name, D-Day. It was the day that would decide the fate of Europe. For nearly 5 years, Nazi Germany had dominated the continent. France, Belgium, Norway, Poland, all under Hitler's control. Britain had survived the Blitz, the Soviet Union was bleeding on the Eastern Front, and millions of lives had already been lost. The Allies knew that to defeat Hitler, they had to open a Western Front, to drive the Germans back from both sides and finally end the war. Planning for the invasion took years. Generals Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley led a force made up of soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and several other Allied nations. They built fake armies in England to trick the Germans. Inflatable tanks, wooden planes, and false radio signals made Hitler believe the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. The deception was called Operation Fortitude, and it worked. When the invasion fleet finally set sail on the night of June 5th, the weather was terrible. High winds, heavy waves, and low clouds. Many commanders wanted to postpone, but General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, made the final call. He looked out at the stormy sea and said quietly, "Okay, let's go." Shortly after midnight, thousands of paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions of the U.S. Army and the British 6th Airborne Division jumped into the darkness behind enemy lines. Many missed their drop zones, landing in flooded fields or German-occupied villages. Some were captured or killed before they even hit the ground. Others regrouped and began sabotaging bridges, roads, and communications. Chaos erupted behind German lines. At dawn, the main assault began. The invasion beaches had code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each would see heroism, blood, and unimaginable loss. At Utah Beach, American troops landed with relatively light resistance. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the 56-year-old son of the former U.S. president, famously told his men, "We'll start the war from right here," after realizing they drifted off course. But at Omaha Beach, everything went wrong. German bunkers lined the cliffs. Machine guns and artillery turned the shoreline into hell. As the landing craft dropped their ramps, men were cut down instantly. The sea ran red. Tanks meant to support the infantry sank before reaching shore. The first waves of soldiers found no cover, only open sand and death. Out of 34,000 who landed there, nearly 2,000 were killed or wounded within hours. Yet somehow, small groups began to push forward. Engineers blew holes in barbed wire. Snipers took out machine gun nests. Medics risked their lives dragging the wounded out of the tide. Slowly, painfully, the Americans gained a foothold. Farther east, at Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian troops fought their way through fortified positions, facing mines, barbed wire, and heavy fire. By the end of the day, they had captured several coastal towns and connected some of the beaches. French resistance fighters, listening on secret radios, rose up to help from within. Behind the beaches, chaos reigned. Paratroopers fought house to house. German reinforcements raced toward the coast but were delayed by Allied bombing runs and sabotage. In some villages, civilians emerged from their homes crying, waving Allied flags they had hidden for years. For them, liberation had finally arrived. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had established a beachhead, not secure but holding. They had suffered over 10,000 casualties, including more than 4,000 dead. The Germans had also lost thousands, but the Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had called impregnable, had been breached. The success of D-Day was not guaranteed. Even Eisenhower had prepared a message in case the invasion failed. It read, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." But by June 7th, the Allies had landed more than 150,000 troops, 10,000 vehicles, and 1,000 tons of supplies. The great gamble had worked. Over the next weeks, fierce battles raged across Normandy's hedgerows, narrow fields bordered by thick earth and brush. Every village, every road had to be fought for. The Germans counterattacked with their elite panzer divisions, but Allied air superiority crushed them. Towns like Cannes and Corentin were reduced to rubble. The skies were filled with Allied bombers, and the nights glowed with fire. By late July, the Allies broke through German lines with Operation Cobra, pushing toward Paris. On August 25, 1944, the French capital was liberated. The road to Germany lay open. The cost was immense. Tens of thousands of soldiers dead, and countless French civilians caught in the crossfire. But D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Within 11 months, Hitler would be dead, and the war in Europe would be over. Still, for those who were there, D-Day was more than history. It was a day of fear, courage, and sacrifice. Survivors described the sound of bullets hitting the water, the cries for medics, the weight of the sea on their backs as they crawled toward shore. Many never made it off the beach. Their bodies still rest in the quiet cemeteries of Normandy, their names carved in white stone. Today, the beaches are peaceful. The bunkers are silent, overgrown with grass. But if you walk along the sand at sunrise, you can almost hear the echoes, the distant hum of engines, the crash of waves, the shouted orders, the prayers whispered under breath. D-Day was not just a battle. It was a turning point in human history. It showed what courage could achieve against tyranny, and what freedom truly costs. The men who stormed those beaches carried not just rifles and packs. They carried the hope of an entire world longing to be free. And as the sun set over Normandy that evening, their victory began to shine, not just across France, but across the entire future of humanity. By the winter of 1944, Nazi Germany was collapsing, but it refused to die. Allied forces had landed in France and were advancing eastward. From the west came the Americans, British, and Canadians. From the east, the Soviet Red Army pushed forward with unstoppable force. Caught in the middle, Hitler's empire was shrinking, its armies retreating, its cities burning. Yet the dictator still believed in victory. He had built his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. But now that dream was ending in ruins that would barely last 12 years. After D-Day, Allied troops liberated France and moved toward the German border. In December 1944, Hitler made one last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Under cover of winter fog, German tanks smashed into the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies by surprise. For weeks, brutal fighting raged in the snow-covered villages of Belgium. American troops were surrounded at Bastogne, refusing to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, General Anthony McAuliffe sent a single-word reply: "Nuts!" Eventually, the skies cleared, and Allied aircraft struck back. The German offensive collapsed, losing its last reserves of fuel and manpower. It was the final major attack of the German army. From that moment on, the war was a retreat. In the east, the Soviet Union was closing in. The Red Army had pushed the Germans out of Poland and crossed into East Prussia. They saw the ruins of villages burned, the death camps abandoned, the horrors the Nazis had left behind. The soldiers' rage grew with every step. They wanted revenge, and it was coming fast. By March 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine River, breaching Germany's final natural defense. British and American forces advanced rapidly through western Germany, capturing city after city. The industrial heart of the Reich, the Ruhr Valley, fell into Allied hands. Entire German divisions surrendered. But Hitler refused to admit defeat. He ordered boys as young as 12 and old men from the Volkssturm militia to fight with rifles and grenades. Berlin was turning into a fortress of hopelessness. In April 1945, the end was near. The Soviets launched their final assault on Berlin, beginning one of the fiercest urban battles in history. Artillery fire turned streets into rubble. Tanks rolled through flames and broken glass. Every building became a battlefield. The smell of smoke and death filled the air. Hitler's once mighty capital was being torn apart piece by piece. Inside his underground bunker, 15 meters beneath the city, Adolf Hitler ranted and gave impossible orders to imaginary divisions that no longer existed. His generals knew it was over. The city was surrounded. Food was running out. Even the sound of artillery could be heard through the concrete walls of the bunker. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun. The next day, they both took their own lives, Hitler with a pistol, Braun with poison. Their bodies were burned in the garden above the bunker as Soviet shells exploded nearby. The man who had plunged the world into darkness was gone. But the war did not end instantly. Fighting continued in the streets of Berlin until May 2nd, when German General Helmuth Weidling surrendered the city to the Soviets. Across Europe, scattered German forces still resisted, but their leaders were gone, their lines broken, their cause lost. On May 7th, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, German General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The next day, May 8th, was declared V-Day, Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across London, Paris, and New York. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, singing, and crying. After 6 years of war, it was finally over. But victory came at a terrible cost. More than 70 million people had died across the globe. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. Europe lay in ruins. Entire cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Warsaw were reduced to ashes. The Holocaust had taken the lives of 6 million Jews, and the world was only beginning to grasp the scale of the horror. In Germany, the aftermath was chaos. Millions of refugees fled from the east. Families were torn apart. Soldiers came home to find nothing left. No homes, no food, no future. The Allied powers divided Germany into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, though deep in Soviet territory, was also split the same way. As the Allies celebrated, tensions began to rise between the West and the Soviet Union. The cooperation that had defeated Hitler quickly turned into suspicion. In the ashes of Berlin, a new conflict was being born: the Cold War. The Nuremberg trials, held from 1945 to 1946, brought the surviving Nazi leaders to justice. Men like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop stood before international judges and faced the evidence of their crimes: concentration camps, mass executions, human experiments, and genocide. For the first time in history, crimes against humanity became a legal concept. Some were executed, others imprisoned, and some, like Göring, took their own lives before the sentence could be carried out. Germany itself had to face the truth. The nation that had once followed Hitler's voice now had to reckon with what it had done and what it had become. The Nazi symbols were torn down. The swastika was banned. Schools began to teach about the crimes of the past so that the next generation would never forget. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had fought on the front lines returned home, not as heroes but as survivors. Many were haunted by what they had seen: the bodies in the snow, the destroyed towns, the endless loss. Some carried guilt, others trauma. The war had ended, but its shadows stayed with them for the rest of their lives. In the months that followed, Europe began to rebuild. The Marshall Plan, launched by the United States, helped restore the shattered economies of Western Europe. Germany was split into 2 countries: West Germany, democratic and rebuilt under American guidance, and East Germany, under Soviet control. Berlin became the heart of this new divide. A city split by ideology, barbed wire, and later a wall. For millions of people, the end of the war meant freedom. But for others, it marked the beginning of decades of occupation, division, and struggle. Still, compared to the nightmare of the Nazi era, even hardship felt like hope. The war that began with tanks crossing Poland in 1939 ended with cities reduced to dust in 1945. It ended in Hitler's bunker, in a ruined Berlin, with the sound of surrender echoing through the broken streets. The man who once promised domination had left only devastation. As peace slowly returned, the world swore a promise: never again. Never again would hatred and blind obedience destroy nations. Never again would silence allow evil to grow. And yet, the lessons of Germany's defeat remain as urgent today as they were in 1945, that power without conscience leads only to ruin, and that even the darkest tyranny can fall when people stand together for freedom. When the guns of the Second World War fell silent, the world discovered something more horrifying than any battle. Behind barbed wire fences, in the ashes of forgotten towns, lay the evidence of a crime so vast it almost defied belief. This was the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others the Nazis deemed unworthy of life. It did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party rose to power in Germany by feeding fear and hatred. They blamed the Jewish people for Germany's defeat in World War I, for the country's economic collapse, and for all its misfortunes. Nazi propaganda, spread through newspapers, posters, and radio, portrayed Jews as subhuman, a threat to the purity of the so-called Aryan race. Soon, laws followed. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and basic rights. They could no longer marry non-Jews, hold government jobs, or attend public schools. Businesses owned by Jewish families were seized. Signs appeared in shop windows, "Jews not welcome." Many Germans turned away, pretending not to see. Others joined in. Hatred had become normal. On the night of November 9, 1938, violence exploded across Germany and Austria. It was called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Nazi mobs destroyed synagogues, looted Jewish homes, and burned thousands of businesses. Windows shattered across the cities, their glass glittering like ice under the streetlights. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered, and tens of thousands were sent to concentration camps. The message was clear. The persecution had only just begun. When the war began in 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, home to Europe's largest Jewish population. In city after city, Jews were forced into overcrowded ghettos, walled districts cut off from the outside world. In Warsaw, more than 400,000 people were crammed into an area barely large enough for 50,000. Starvation, disease, and cold killed thousands every month. The ghettos were meant to be temporary, but soon they became waiting rooms for death. In 1941, Hitler made his most terrifying decision. As the German army invaded the Soviet Union, he ordered what he called the final solution to the Jewish question. The goal was simple and horrifying: the total extermination of the Jewish people in Europe. The killing began immediately. Behind the advancing German troops followed special units called Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads. They rounded up Jews, Roma, and political opponents in towns and villages, forcing them to dig their own graves before shooting them by the thousands. In places like Babi Yar in Ukraine, over 33,000 people were massacred in just 2 days. But mass shootings were too slow, too visible. The Nazis wanted something more efficient, so they built death camps, factories of murder across occupied Poland. Names that would forever scar human history: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, Belzec, Majdanek. At these camps, trains arrived daily, carrying people from all over Europe. Families were told they were being resettled. They brought suitcases, photos, even children's toys, never knowing they were heading to their deaths. Upon arrival, SS officers separated men from women and children. Doctors pointed left or right. One direction meant forced labor, the other meant death. In Auschwitz, the largest of them all, gas chambers disguised as showers could kill 2,000 people at once. The victims were locked inside as Zyklon B gas was dropped through vents above. Within minutes, screams fell silent. Afterward, the bodies were burned in giant crematoria. Gold teeth were pulled from mouths, hair was shaved, and possessions were sorted. Every trace of humanity stolen, every life reduced to ashes. Over time, the killing expanded. Not only Jews but also Roma, Gypsies, disabled people, homosexuals, Soviet prisoners, and political dissidents were sent to die. Anyone the Nazi ideology considered inferior had no right to live. Even as the war began to turn against Germany, the killings continued. Trains still ran. Camps still burned. In early 1944, when Hungarian Jews were deported, more than 400,000 were sent to Auschwitz in just 2 months. The Nazis knew they were losing the war, but they wanted to destroy as many lives as possible before they fell. Yet even in this darkness, there were sparks of courage. In 1943, prisoners in the Warsaw Ghetto rose up against the Nazis. Armed with stolen weapons and Molotov cocktails, they fought for nearly a month before being crushed. At camps like Treblinka and Sobibor, inmates staged revolts, blowing up parts of the facilities and escaping into the forests. Most were hunted down, but their defiance proved that even facing death, the human spirit could still fight back. In January 1945, as the Soviet army approached, the Nazis tried to erase the evidence of their crimes. Camps were destroyed, records burned, prisoners forced on death marches through snow and ice. Thousands died along the roads from exhaustion and cold. When Soviet troops reached Auschwitz on January 27th, they found mountains of shoes, hair, and suitcases, and around 7,000 survivors barely alive. The world finally saw the truth. When the Allied forces liberated other camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, even hardened soldiers were left speechless. The stench of death hung in the air. Skeleton-like figures wandered through the barracks. Piles of bodies lay unburied. General Dwight D. Eisenhower insisted that everything be photographed and documented. "The world must see this," he said, "or some will say it never happened." After the war, at the Nuremberg trials, Nazi officials were confronted with the evidence. They tried to claim they were just following orders, but the judges rejected that excuse. The Holocaust was declared a crime against humanity, a crime that would haunt the conscience of the world forever. For the survivors, life after liberation was not easy. They had lost families, homes, and identities. Many could not find where they belonged. Some rebuilt their lives in Israel, America, or Europe, but the scars, both physical and emotional, never healed completely. The nightmares never left them. The Holocaust was not an accident of war. It was the result of hatred, obedience, and indifference, the belief that some people are less human than others. It showed how propaganda, fear, and lies can turn neighbors into killers and silence into complicity. Today, the remains of Auschwitz stand as a museum, a silent witness to what happened. The barbed wire, the empty barracks, the piles of shoes and glasses, they are not relics of history. They are warnings, because the Holocaust was not only about the millions who died. It was also about the millions who watched and did nothing. The survivors' voices still echo through time, reminding us, never forget, never again. Their words are a call to the future, to recognize the danger of hatred, to defend truth against denial, and to remember that humanity is fragile, but compassion can endure even the darkest night. When World War II erupted in 1939, it wasn't just a clash of nations, it was a revolution in weaponry. Never before had humanity created such machines of destruction. The war became a proving ground for engineers, scientists, and generals, each racing to build the deadliest tools of domination. In the early days, Germany shocked the world with Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. At the heart of this strategy were tanks, fast, coordinated, and ruthless. The German panzer divisions sliced through Poland and France like a knife through paper. Tanks like the Panzer IV and later the Tiger I became symbols of terror. The Tiger's thick armor and powerful 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank from over a mile away. Its roar on the battlefield sent shivers down soldiers' spines. But it came at a cost. Tigers were heavy, slow, and mechanically unreliable. Still, they embodied Nazi Germany's obsession with power and perfection. Across the Channel, the British responded with their own innovations. The Churchill tank, though slow, was nearly indestructible and played a vital role in D-Day. The Americans entered the war with the M4 Sherman, mass-produced in staggering numbers, over 50,000 units. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank, but it was reliable, easy to repair, and came in endless variations. Flamethrowers, bridge layers, amphibious versions. Where German tanks outclassed the Sherman one-on-one, the Allies won through numbers, coordination, and adaptability. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union developed a machine that would change armored warfare forever, the T-34. It was simple, rugged, and built for the harsh Russian winters. Its sloped armor deflected shells that would have destroyed other tanks. Even German generals like Heinz Guderian admitted the T-34 was the best tank of its time. By the end of the war, over 57,000 T-34s rolled out of Soviet factories, a testament to the power of industrial might. But tanks were only one part of the equation. The skies above Europe and the Pacific became another deadly battlefield. Air power transformed warfare. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, began the war with dominance. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the terrifying Stuka dive bomber rained destruction with precision. The sound of a Stuka's siren, the Jericho trumpet, became infamous, a psychological weapon meant to break the enemy's spirit before the bombs even fell. However, by 1943, the balance began to shift. The Allies introduced superior aircraft. The Spitfire defended Britain's skies with unmatched agility during the Battle of Britain, turning the tide of air warfare. The P-51 Mustang, an American long-range fighter, escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, crippling German industry. High above, massive B-17 Flying Fortresses and Lancaster bombers carried out devastating raids over Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden, cities reduced to flames and rubble. In the Pacific, air power reached new heights and new horrors. The Japanese introduced the Mitsubishi Zero, a nimble and deadly fighter that ruled the skies early in the war. But the United States countered with aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and the B-29 Superfortress, which would later carry the atomic bombs. The Pacific skies were a brutal dance of death, from the carrier decks of Midway to the fiery skies over Iwo Jima. Then came one of the war's most chilling innovations, the V-weapons. In 1944, Germany began launching V-1 flying bombs, early cruise missiles, at London. They buzzed through the night sky before slamming into cities without warning. Soon after came the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile. It struck without sound or sight, descending faster than any aircraft could react. Thousands died, and yet these rockets would later inspire the technology that took humanity to space. It was a dark irony, weapons of destruction paving the path to exploration. At sea, another kind of machine changed the face of warfare, the submarine. German U-boats hunted Allied convoys across the Atlantic, sinking thousands of tons of supplies. For a time, it seemed the Allies might starve. But radar, sonar, and code-breaking turned the tide. The once invisible predators became prey. Weapons weren't only about machines. Science itself became a weapon. From radar and code machines like Enigma to medical advances and chemical warfare research, World War II pushed technology decades ahead. In secret laboratories, both sides worked on terrifying experiments. Poison gas was banned after World War I, but biological and chemical weapons were still tested. Engineers raced to create better bombs, faster planes, stronger armor. Human ingenuity reached new heights and new depths, and while the world's great powers fought with tanks and planes, the common soldier carried his own tools of war. The American M1 Garand rifle, the German MP-40 submachine gun, the Soviet PPSH-41, and the British Lee-Enfield, these weapons became extensions of the men who held them. Each shot fired represented a heartbeat, a decision, a life changed forever. As the war drew to a close in 1945, battlefields across the world were littered with the remains of human invention: twisted metal, burnt engines, and shattered dreams. The weapons that once symbolized progress now stood as monuments to destruction. The war had ended, but it left behind a new world, one shaped by machines, technology, and the sobering realization of what humankind could create when driven by fear and survival. The Second World War proved that weapons alone do not win wars, people do. But it also showed how far humanity would go to gain an edge in battle. The tanks, planes, and deadly machines of that era became legends, not of glory, but of warning. They remind us that progress without humanity leads not to victory, but to devastation. While tanks thundered across Europe and planes blackened the skies, another war was being fought, silent, invisible, and deadly. It was the war of spies, codes, and deception. A war without uniform or front line, but one that shaped the outcome of World War II more than any other battlefield. From London to Berlin, Washington to Moscow, the world's greatest minds and boldest operatives risked everything in the shadows. The weapons of this war were not bullets or bombs, they were secrets. At the heart of this invisible conflict was code breaking. The Germans believed their encrypted messages, sent through the Enigma machine, were unbreakable. Enigma used a series of rotating wheels and electrical circuits that changed every day, creating billions of possible combinations. The Nazis trusted it completely for military orders, submarine positions, and top-secret communications. But in a quiet English estate called Bletchley Park, a group of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts worked around the clock to unlock its mysteries. Leading them was a young genius named Alan Turing. Through brilliant logic and invention, Turing and his team built the world's first programmable computer, the bomb, which could test thousands of possible Enigma settings per second. By 1941, the British had cracked Enigma. Suddenly, they could read German naval and army communications almost in real time. The information, codenamed Ultra, was one of the Allies' most closely guarded secrets. It helped the Royal Navy hunt down U-boats, guided bombing raids, and even revealed the timing of major offensives. Winston Churchill later said, "It was thanks to Ultra that we won the war." But the Allies were not alone in their intelligence efforts. In the East, Soviet spies penetrated deep into Western institutions. Networks like the Cambridge Five, a group of British double agents secretly working for Moscow, passed vital information to the USSR. Their members, including Kim Philby and Guy Burgess, operated for years undetected. They provided the Soviets with crucial data about Allied strategies, nuclear research, and political discussions, altering the balance of post-war power. Meanwhile, in Nazi-occupied Europe, resistance networks were thriving. In France, Norway, Poland, and the Netherlands, men and women risked their lives to pass on information, sabotage German operations, and help Allied pilots escape. Messages were hidden in bread loaves, inked in invisible chemicals, or transmitted in short, coded radio bursts. If caught, the punishment was brutal torture, execution, or deportation to concentration camps. Yet thousands continued, driven by courage and hope. In the United States, a new kind of intelligence was born. The Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, became America's first major spy organization, the forerunner of today's CIA. The OSS recruited scientists, journalists, linguists, and even Hollywood filmmakers. One of their most famous agents was Virginia Hall, an American woman with a wooden leg. Operating in France, she organized resistance groups, coordinated airdrops, and evaded the Gestapo for years. The Germans called her the most dangerous Allied spy. Another hero of the hidden war was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard known by his codename Garbo. He created a completely fictional network of double agents who fed false intelligence to the Germans. His fabricated reports convinced Hitler that the D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy, one of the greatest deceptions in military history. Garbo was decorated by both the Allies and the Axis, a master of illusion who fooled everyone. Deception operations became an art form. Before D-Day, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, a massive disinformation campaign. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fake radio traffic made it seem like 1,000,000 men were preparing to invade northern France. The real invasion, however, would strike Normandy. German generals fell for the ruse completely, keeping their best forces away from the actual landing sites until it was too late. On the other side, the Abwehr, Nazi Germany's intelligence agency, fought to uncover Allied secrets and run its own spy networks. Led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the Abwehr operated across Europe. Yet Canaris himself secretly despised Hitler and later became involved in plots to overthrow him. Betrayed and arrested, he was executed in 1945. His story remains one of the most complex tales of loyalty and betrayal in the Shadow War. In the Pacific, intelligence was equally decisive. American cryptanalysts cracked Japan's secret diplomatic code, known as Purple, long before Pearl Harbor. Later, they broke Japan's naval code JN-25, which revealed Japanese fleet movements. This crucial discovery led to the American victory at Midway in 1942, a turning point of the war. When U.S. forces shot down the plane carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's top strategist, it was thanks to intercepted and decrypted messages. The Japanese never realized their codes had been compromised until it was far too late. Throughout the war, information became more valuable than gold. Every secret gained or lost could cost thousands of lives. Radio operators transmitted under constant danger, knowing that enemy direction finders could locate their signals within minutes. Agents memorized ciphers and cover stories, lived under false identities, and operated behind enemy lines for months, sometimes years, without backup. Some were captured and killed. Others disappeared forever, their stories buried by history. But their work, the secrets they stole, the lies they spread, the messages they decoded, changed the course of the war. By 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, the shadow world of intelligence had expanded into a global network. New alliances and rivalries were born. The Cold War was already taking shape. The skills, technology, and methods developed during World War II would define espionage for decades to come. The hidden war of intelligence was not fought for glory. It was fought in the dark, in whispers, in codes, in courage. The spies, codebreakers, and double agents of World War II never led armies, but they decided where those armies marched. In the end, it was their invisible victories that turned the tide of history. While generals planned strategies and soldiers fought on distant battlefields, millions of ordinary men, women, and children lived through the unimaginable. World War II was not only fought by armies, it was endured by civilians. For them, every day became a struggle to find food, safety, and hope in a world consumed by chaos. When the first bombs fell on Warsaw in 1939, the world realized that civilians would not be spared. Cities became battlegrounds. Families awoke to the sound of sirens, the sky glowing red as firestorms devoured entire streets. Mothers carried children into basements and cellars, praying the next explosion wouldn't find them. In London, during the Blitz, people slept in underground train stations. Over 40,000 civilians were killed, yet Londoners refused to surrender. They went to work amid ruins, brewed tea beside shattered walls, and hung signs that read, "Business as usual." It was resilience, painted in dust and courage. Across Europe, daily life was reshaped by fear and scarcity. Food was rationed. Bread, sugar, meat, all became luxuries. In Germany, propaganda promised victory, but the reality was hunger and loss. In France and the Netherlands, people relied on black markets and hidden farms. In the Soviet Union, starvation reached catastrophic levels. The siege of Leningrad, lasting 872 days, cost nearly 1 million civilian lives. People ate wallpaper paste, boiled leather, and even resorted to unthinkable acts to survive. Yet, even in that frozen hell, orchestras played symphonies to keep the spirit of humanity alive. Children grew up under the shadow of war. Some were evacuated from cities, torn away from their parents. Others became refugees, walking hundreds of miles through snow and ruins. In occupied Poland, Jewish children were forced into ghettos. overcrowded, disease-ridden places where death came silently, day after day. In secret, teachers risked execution to hold underground schools. To teach was an act of rebellion. To learn was an act of faith. Meanwhile, women stepped into roles that had once been closed to them. With millions of men at the front, women became the backbone of nations. They worked in factories building planes, tanks, and ammunition. They farmed fields, drove buses, and repaired machines. In America, Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of female strength. Sleeves rolled up, ready to fight the war with tools instead of guns. In Britain, women joined the Women's Land Army, growing food for the nation. In the Soviet Union, they fought as snipers, pilots, and partisans. Their courage redefined what it meant to be a hero. For those living under occupation, life meant constant fear. Nazi patrols roamed the streets, and curfews dictated every movement. Neighbors vanished overnight, taken for questioning or deported to camps. Yet resistance was everywhere. In whispered conversations, in hidden radios, in secret notes passed between hands. Ordinary people became messengers, couriers, and saboteurs. They hid Jewish families in attics and barns, forged documents, and risked execution to protect strangers. One of them was Miep Gies, a Dutch woman who sheltered in Frank and her family. When the Gestapo finally discovered them, Miep managed to save N's diary, the words that would later speak for millions of silenced souls. In the countryside, survival looked different. Farmers became the lifeline for starving cities. But even they were not safe. Bombers targeted railways and supply lines, burning fields and villages. In Eastern Europe, entire communities were wiped out in retaliation for resistance attacks. In Asia, the suffering was equally immense. In China, Japanese occupation brought terror. The Nanjing massacre left hundreds of thousands dead. In the Philippines, families hid in jungles, living off wild plants to escape invasion. War made the world smaller and far more dangerous. Despite the darkness, people found ways to hold on to normal life. Weddings were celebrated in bomb shelters. Music was played over crackling radios. Letters from the front were read aloud by candlelight, often months late, sometimes never answered. Faith in God, in love, in the idea that peace would return, became a weapon of endurance. In America, though far from the front lines, life changed too. Families hung gold or blue stars in their windows. Blue for a son serving, gold for one who would never return. Factories ran day and night, producing weapons for the Allies. Posters urged people to conserve, recycle, and do your part. Children collected scrap metal. Everyone, in some way, was part of the war effort. As the conflict dragged on, exhaustion grew. Cities like Berlin, Tokyo, and Dresden turned into infernos under relentless bombing. Families dug through rubble for lost photographs and memories. In the final months, refugees flooded the roads. Tens of millions displaced across Europe and Asia. The human cost was staggering. Over 50 million civilians perished. Behind every number was a story, a family, a home, a song, a dream. Then, in 1945, it ended. Bells rang in shattered cities. People wept, danced, and embraced strangers in the streets. But victory was bittersweet. Those who survived faced a new kind of battle, rebuilding their lives. The war had changed everything: borders, governments, beliefs, and hearts. Many returned to find their homes gone, their families lost. Yet they began again. From the ashes of war rose a new generation, one that carried both the scars and the wisdom of suffering. They built peace not out of strength, but out of memory. The story of World War II is often told through soldiers and leaders, but the true soul of that war lived in the kitchens, cellars, and fields, where ordinary people refused to give up. They faced hunger, fear, and loss with a quiet kind of heroism that history books rarely capture. Their strength was not in weapons or ranks, but in endurance, in love that survived separation, in songs sung beneath air raid sirens, in the belief that no matter how dark the night, morning would come again. That is how ordinary people survived the greatest war the world has ever known, not through power, but through hope.